Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. Thank you for downloading. My name is Renée Manderville, a project manager at the Indian Ocean World Center, or IOWC, at McGill University. I am joined by Drs. Philip Gooding and Archisman Chaudhuri, two postdoctoral fellows at the IOWC.
Hi, Renée. It's great to be recording a podcast with you again.
Hi, Renée. Thank you so much for having me here again.
So you'll hear more from them later, but today we are thrilled to be joined by Professor Thomas Kuehn, an Associate Professor of History at Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. Professor Kuehn holds a PhD in History and Middle Eastern Studies from New York University. He is the author of Empire, Islam, and the Politics of Difference, published in 2011 with Brill, and of several peer-reviewed journal articles and chapters, including recently, We Know Nothing About Yemen, Ottoman Imperial Governance in Southwest Arabia, and the Politics of Knowledge Production, 1871 to 1914, which was published in 2018 in the first issue of the 8th volume of the Journal of Arabian Studies. Today, Professor Kuehn is here to discuss with us one of his forthcoming publications entitled Managing the Hazards of Yemen's Natural Environment, Nature and Imperial Governance in Ottoman Southwest Arabia, 1872 to 1914, a theme on which he actually presented at the Indian Ocean World Center in our speaker series in 2018. So, Professor Kuehn, thank you so much for joining us today and for discussing this topic. We're delighted to be recording this podcast with you today.
Hello, Renée. Hello, Archisman. Hello, Philip. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. And so to begin, could you just in brief terms discuss your forthcoming chapter? What were the hazards of the natural environment in Ottoman Southwest Arabia, and how did the Ottoman Empire seek to manage them?
I should start by mentioning that the work that we are discussing here is meant to be published as part of an edited volume that two colleagues of mine in Germany, Katharina Lange and Juliane Schumacher, who are both affiliated with the Zentrum Moderne Orient in Berlin, are preparing for publication, but it is also part of a second book project that I'm now working on, tentatively titled Ottoman Yemen, A Connected History, that ties Ottoman Yemen by looking at human, commercial, political connections to other parts of the Ottoman Empire, not just Istanbul, but also to different portions of the Indian Ocean world. I should probably start by saying a few words about Yemen or Southwest Arabia in the Ottoman Empire. And the area that we are talking about here includes roughly what used to be the Yemen Arab Republic before the unification of Yemen in 1990, plus the region of Asir, which today is part of Saudi Arabia. And this area was at one point for about 100 years part of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and into the mid-17th centuries. It was part of Ottoman expansion into the Red Sea and Indian Ocean worlds, and played a very important role in the evolving imperial competition between the Portuguese and the Ottomans in the Red and Indian Ocean regions. The Ottomans lost control of Yemen in the mid-17th century, and my work here is very much located in the wider context of an Ottoman reconquest of Yemen, which was a remarkable episode in the late history of the empire that for a very long time historians were accustomed to interpret as a period of imperial contraction, even decline, and the Ottomans being on the defensive against other imperial powers. And so Yemen, in a way, bucks the trend here, because the Ottomans returned to Southwest Arabia from the 1820s, 1830s onwards, initially with the help of regional vassals like the governor of Egypt, the sheriffs of Mecca, and then from the 1840s and especially the 1870s, with the involvement especially of the Ottoman central government in Istanbul. So we have a period of reconquest in the early 1870s, and the Ottomans, in one way or another, retained control of this chunk of Southwest Arabia into the early 1920s, into the years just after World War I. Yemen became a very important imperial project for the Ottomans because it was a showcase that the Ottoman Empire still counted against its rivals, Britain, Italy, and France in that region. And Yemen became more and more important in a wider imperial policy whereby Southwest Arabia was meant to protect another part of the Arabian Peninsula, namely the Hijaz, with the holy sites of Mecca and Medina, against possible European incursions. Retaining control of this area was very, very important ideologically for the Ottomans, whose rulers claimed the caliphate and leadership of the Muslim world for themselves. So I think this is an important context for us to understand for the 19th century. And what Ottoman military officers, ordinary soldiers, bureaucrats, and the people around them experienced was a very challenging environment of a semi-desert region in Yemen's coastal plain, the Tihama, and then one of the most challenging mountain ranges in the Middle East and in Arabia more specifically. So Mount Nabi Juaib, for example, at 3,600 meters is the highest mountain in Arabia in general, and it's part of a larger mountainous region that the local population had always used to good effect for terraced agriculture, but also for defensive purposes. And for the Ottomans, asserting their control over this mountainous area in a time before, for example, fighter aircraft, before helicopters, and these tools of war proved very difficult. And if you look at the writings of different Ottoman bureaucrats and military officers from this period, from the 1870s to the end of empire, the question of how you keep troops alive, how you fight effectively, how you supply people, and how you deal with things like the occasional famine and bouts of drought are very, very prominent.
Thank you so much for that answer, Professor Kuehn. I will now follow up with one additional question before passing over to our postdoctoral fellows. So my question is about the relationship between Ottoman military commanders in Yemen and Istanbul. You very briefly mentioned the military commanders, but you note that commanders emphasize the importance of knowing the natural environment in Yemen for successful military campaigns, and wrote about the natural environment and about tactics about how to tackle it. So was this part of a larger Ottoman imperial tradition of developing knowledge of the natural environment for military expansion? Giancarlo Casale's book, The Ottoman Age of Exploration, discusses how the Ottoman Empire developed its own maps and atlases of the Indian Ocean to counter the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean. Thus, I kind of wonder, who was the audience the commanders were writing for? Was it for the purpose of knowledge production within frontier commanders? Or are these reports being sent back to Istanbul for the purposes of, for example, acquiring more backing for their campaigns? And in this context, sorry, this is a long question. In this context, could you perhaps explain more about the nature and extent of communication between frontier commanders in Yemen and the Istanbul metropole? For example, were they reliant on Istanbul for supplies and logistical support?
So thank you for starting me off with the question of knowledge production. And I think, as Giancarlo Casale has demonstrated, in the early modern period, before the 19th century, gathering information on regions that were strategically, economically, commercially important was a very important feature of how the Ottomans governed their far-flung lands. But I think what we are dealing with here in the period starting in the 18th century, but more significantly in the 19th, is something that scholars who have taken their cue from Michel Foucault have, with reference to some of his work, called governmentality, namely the idea that you objectify, that you see the local population as an object, as a target of governmental intervention, and as well, alongside that, the local regions, their natural environments, and their particular features. So making them known was a way to optimize, to make more efficient the reach of the state into the local society. And I think what is important to understand is that this acquired particular importance from the 1830s, 1840s, and after, from the period of the Tanzimat, the period of Ottoman reform onwards, because as experienced more pressure, more competition from rival imperial powers. As the empire and its leaders were more and more called upon to mobilize local reserves, both human, commercial, and economic, there was they no longer could afford to leave alone, to leave to their own devices, regions, resources, and people. So mise en valeur, as Francophone imperialists in the 19th century called it, making use, exploiting local resources became more and more important. So I think what we are seeing here, gathering information on topography, on climate, on water supply, on diseases, were very important. Were a very important aspect of this governmentality. And I think it's very important that you framed your question around the agency of individual commanders or bureaucrats, for example, or sometimes also, of course, local elite members, and not in a blanket term, the Ottoman state. Because I think, as I tried to demonstrate in my work, ideas and notions of what the characteristics of local society and the local environment differed very strongly. And for example, some of the writings that you refer to in your question, for example, Ahmed Rashid's History of Yemen and of Sana'a, that was published immediately after the early campaigns of reconquest in the 1870s. They were probably commissioned by the government, but others were not. Often the circuits of knowledge production, individual commanders or governors acquiring information about local realities was their own initiative, was something that bypassed official circuits of communication. So yes, we have, for example, commissions of inspection that are tasked to look into possibilities for expanding irrigation and commercialized agriculture. But we also have very, very telling examples of individual military officers who are about to deploy to Yemen. They explain often in their memoirs they can't find any substantial information, so they talk to those of their peers who have served in Yemen. They take notes. They share maybe sketch maps that field commanders have made. And so I think to recognize here that the Ottoman state was a contested and very diverse field with actors who often were not on the same page is very, very important. And I think what is also important is that we, for example, should heed the advice of someone like Al-Mikhail, who said we should be suspicious of interpretations that always look at regions like Yemen or Egypt or Ottoman Iraq only in relation to the center, to Istanbul. the rim dynamics, where people who had served, for example, in Ottoman North Africa, today's Libya, or in Iraq, may have some important insights of what it is like to serve in provinces with extreme climate, is something that we shouldn't forget about.
Oh, thank you so much for that answer, Professor Kuehn. I will now pass questioning over to our postdoctoral fellows. So starting with Philip.
Thank you, Renée, and thank you, Professor Kuehn, for presenting your research to us. I find your answer to your last question incredibly interesting, something more broadly about the importance of the man on the ground, or the woman on the ground, as it sometimes is as well, for understanding imperial networks. It's certainly a broader theme to be drawn on there. In any case, my question actually is on something entirely different. The case study you present here stands out from other frontier regions of the Ottoman Empire. Alan McGill, Michael Christopher Lowe, Faisal Hussein, and Chris Gratian paint a different picture of Ottoman engagements with the natural world in respectively Egypt, the Hijaz, the province of Baghdad, and different parts of Anatolia since the 18th century. There, as you note of their work, the Ottomans sought to master local nature through irrigation, enhanced water supply technology, the damming of rivers, and the draining of swamp areas. By contrast, you argue that in Yemen, from the 1870s onwards, the Ottoman state was not only unable, but also unwilling to commit the necessary resources to embark on these kinds of projects. My question is simply, why? But as sub-questions, what was it about Yemen that made the Ottoman state less invested in changing the natural environment there? Alternatively, do you think a focus on the Yemen case study may necessitate a revision of understandings of Ottoman engagements with natural environments elsewhere in other frontier regions? For example, have the scholars mentioned overstated the Ottoman Empire's efforts and achievements in this context?
That's a wonderful question. So what the work is more broadly about is broadening our understanding of what Frederick Cooper and Jane Burbank call the repertoire of imperial governance here. And it's very clear that the scholars you've mentioned have made great strides in furthering our understanding for that. But what you see here in the work in the different case studies is a focus on large projects and often massive state involvement. So, for example, in Michael Christopher Lowe's article on the technopolitics of the Hamidian state in the Hijaz in the 1880s, he talks about a water supply a project for Mecca that lasts for, I think, 3 years, employs 3,000 workers, and costs a very large amount of money. And Chris Gratian talks about among the several examples that he provides in his article that you refer to, for example, to a swamp drainage project in the Ottoman Balkans that goes on over 20 years. And it takes an enormous amount, not just of correspondence, but also of resources here. And in Yemen, why does it not happen? Why is it in Yemen, why does the focus, at least in terms of practice, stay more or less within the realm of protecting Ottoman servicemen, the Ottoman military, from drought, from extreme heat, from supply problems, etc. And I think there are a number of answers one can give here, I think the most important one has something to do with the way that the Ottoman imperial leadership in the Ottoman central government prioritizes Yemen within the larger context of the Ottoman Empire. And I think what my research suggests is that at the end of the day, Yemen was there to protect the Hijaz. And the Ottomans were they saw their main task in containing the influence of the Zaydi Shia imams, because they were perceived as a competition to the claim of Sultan Abdul Hamid II to the caliphate. So long as that was accomplished, so long as Ottoman bureaucrats, military officers, and their local allies, very importantly, delivered on that, I think the regime of Abdul Hamid was not very ambitious in tapping the resources, even though bureaucrats and many other observers, local petitioners, for example, included, kept pointing to the local potential. To the potential for expanding the growth of cotton in the Tihama, to expanding the production of coffee in the Central Highlands, and even with schemes to reconstruct the famous high dam of Marib that had existed in antiquity. And I think what in this way that Yemen, the role that Yemen was meant to play in this larger Hamidian conception of imperial politics, left room for Ottoman members of government, both local and from outside the province, and their local allies, to cooperate in exploiting the population, in overtaxing them, in seeking short-term gain. And I think this way of colluding with local elites and exploiting the population was a very important reason why the Ottomans had so many uprisings, insurgencies on their hands. And because of the large number of insurgencies, things military took a particularly important role, took precedence in budgeting. And as a number of commission inspectors, for example, pointed out in the 1890s and after, that didn't leave time and that didn't leave money to construct a modern system of roads and to put money into long-term projects like irrigation, like artesian wells, like dams, and the like. So this is a long-winded answer to the question, but I think it has to do with the fact that if certain imperial objectives were met, the Hamidian regime looked the other way. When a part of its officialdom and local elites did things that in the long run actually led to local unrest and kept the military at the center of Ottoman imperial governance.
Thank you, Professor Kuehn. I'll now pass over to Archisman to ask a question as well.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Professor Kuehn. My question is about the intersection between perceptions of environment and people. You note that Ottoman military commanders viewed Yemen's terrain and environment as difficult and challenging, owing to its mountainous areas of the northern highlands and the desert, the savanna, and forest areas of the coastal plains. These are also words that could equally be used to describe the Ottoman state's perceptions of people in Yemen more generally. They had different customs and dispositions to people in the Ottoman heartland. They formed rebellions, and they were ultimately difficult and challenging to govern. I wondered about the extent to which these discourses were intertwined. Did the Ottoman state view Yemen's environment as difficult and challenging because that is the way they saw the region's peoples? Or alternatively, were their views of Yemen's peoples clouded by their perception of Yemen's environment as difficult and challenging?
Archisman, thank you so much for that question. I think it goes really to the heart of a lot of the debates that happens among Ottoman bureaucrats and military officers in the period that I study. So what you often find are representations of local communities, both in the different highland regions as well as in the coastal plain, that point to this to a very symbiotic relationship between the people and their environment. To the extent that many Ottoman observers actually considered the locals really as part of the environment, and they would say that living in these extreme climatic conditions has produced, quote unquote, one of the most remarkable a group of fighters, for example. So that they were that the idea, for example, that because of living in this environment for centuries, locals were not as vulnerable to heat, water, and temperatures as, for example, the regular conscript from Ottoman Syria or Ottoman Anatolia. And what we are dealing with here, of course, is a highly essentializing portrayals that have often strongly racializing undertones. And so that the local people are seen as extensions, as part of the local environment, is very much part of that. And so I think in a way to come back to Archisman's question, for Ottoman observers it cut in both directions. A difficult environment had produced individuals who were formidable fighters, and that were difficult to deal with, but because you dealt with rugged mountains and desert regions as well, these people were also difficult to reach for a state with centralizing ambitions that was often intended to reach more deeply into local society and make more demands on them. So I think it really cuts both ways.
Thank you, Professor Kuehn. I will now pass over to Renée to wrap up.
Thank you, Archisman. And thank you again, Professor Kuehn, for discussing your work and for answering our questions. Links to Professor Kuehn's bio and his book are in the description for this podcast. Thank you also to Philip for his questions, and thank you to you, our listeners, for downloading. Once again, my name is Renée Manderville, and you have been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.